Dear students, welcome to this presentation of Unit 14, Europe in the 17th Century. This unit continues what we studied in the previous one, but from the European point of view, not just the Spanish one. This century, as we have said, it's a time of crisis. There were bad harvests due to this small ice age, we said, that make the crops decrease, having less food for all the people. That meant the living condition of the peasants decreased a lot. They had less food, less resources, and for that reason, less incomes. And because of the crisis, their money has less value as well. Finally, famines and the illnesses increase exponentially the mortality for these people. This meant that an important amount of people started living in poverty. In other times of history, there has always been rich and poor, but as it always happens in times of crisis, the difference between rich and poor became wider. This led to beggars and these picaros we have said, and it also meant that the demographic growth stopped. There was an interruption of this increase in the population that was common in the previous centuries. Here we can see a graph with the population of the different countries. We can see how between the beginning and the end of the 17th century, the population stops growing. It grows very, very little for 100 years. And actually, in some places it decreased. For example, in Germany. In Germany, it decreases because of the 30 Years' War. Here we can see how the most populated country is France. This was very important in this time as the human capital, the amount of people that live in a country, meant more soldiers, more workers, more taxes. So it made a country much more powerful. And that led also to emigrations. The bad living condition in Europe made many people to emigrate, especially to America. We have mentioned the Spanish emigrations to North and South America, but of course there were other Europeans that went to America. For example, the French to the Louisiana, or the Caribbean, such as Haiti, the English. Here we can see the Mayflower, this ship that went to the coast of what nowadays are the United States or even the Dutch. This is the time of the Pilgrims, these first English-speaking inhabitants of the territory that nowadays is the United States. They are considered the founders of that country. And it's the time of another very important change in society and economy, which is the domestic system. This domestic system is one of the earliest stages of capitalism. It consisted that one person, a bourgeois, a rich merchant, bought different raw materials and tools and everything needed for example, making clothes. And then he sold all of these raw materials to people that work them in their houses. So, for example, he bought uh, tons of fabric in order to make clothes. He sold them to the peasants. The peasant, each one on their house, made those clothes and then sold them the finished piece to the businessman. Then the businessman took all of these products to the city to sell them there. It's one of the earliest stages of the factory system. But instead of having all the people working on a single building, a factory, each one of the workers were on their own house. But the system was the same. One rich people obtain the materials, the workers transform them in ended products, and then the rich men obtain the profit selling it in the city. The greatest example of this economical growth and changes in the world was England. England had this domestic system, had a very important commerce networks between Europe and America. They were very great sailors that trade with different territories, start expanding through Africa and Asia and the Pacific Ocean, and had, for example, like here, a red of canals that connected his territory. That's very important because in a time previous to highways and railway tracks, the only way to connect in a quick and easy way the different towns and cities were the canals. So England could have um, domestic trade very, very important. It is also the origin of some measures that improve the production in agriculture and so on. For example, new machines to harvest the crops. But it was also a time of war and conflict. It's the time of the 30 Years' War that we have already talked about when talking about Spain, but it was very important for the whole of Europe. Many, many different European countries participate on it. This meant the mortality increased a lot. Here we can see a skull wearing the imperial crown. It's from the imperial burial chamber in Vienna. And for example, this common graveyard in the Czech Republic with the dead because of the plague that isolated the land in this century. We have talked about this triangular trade, which was very important at that time and consisted of the exchange of elaborated products from Europe, slaves from Africa, and raw materials from America. At the beginning, this trade was controlled by the Spanish and the Portuguese, then later, because of the crisis of these countries and the improvement of others, started being controlled by the French and especially the British and the Dutch. So the 17th century is a time of crisis with a decline in the demographic growth, so a stop in this growth that in some cases could mean that it decreases. The greatest advantage was for England that developed economically and politically. The 30 Years' War uh, was able to destroy the power of the traditional nations, such as Spain and the Empire, that saw how their power was lost and were substituted by other people, especially the English, but also the French and the Dutch. The Atlantic trade became more and more and more important, uh, meaning that the traditional trade areas such as the Mediterranean and the Baltic lose importance. They lose importance and the Atlantic growth. The Dutch and the English established colonies in America and in Asia. For example, the island of Jamaica was established by the English, or Guyana by the Dutch, or colonies in Indonesia and Borneo and Malaysia. And for the economic aspect, The manufacture production increased, especially in the hands of these Dutch and English, and the domestic system became more and more important. Remember, this is the production of woods in the house of the peasant on their free time. So they, for example, labor the land, and when they finish, they, in order to obtain more money, work for some merchant that they have given to them the raw materials and will buy them the ended product in order to sell it. We can see how the 17th century was a crisis, and as many crises, it meant a change. It's a change of power, both political and economical. If economically the greatest favor was the British, in the political aspect was France, the most clearly favored. The French became probably the most powerful country in that time, and it's characterized by what is called absolutism. The absolutism is the economic system in which one person, the king, had all the power. This can sound obvious because we normally imagine the medieval kings to have all the power, but it wasn't exactly true. They were subdued to the parliaments, to the interest of the nobility, and so on. For example, we explained with the Catholic monarchs how the monarchs had to fight against the nobles that want to impose their power. I was saying how in Aragon they have this pactism system that meant that the king need to reach agreement with the different territories. In France, they fought all of this. They established a centralized power where the king could impose his volunty, his will. The main representative of this is Louis XIV, known as the Roi Soleil, the Sun King. Here we can see him dressed like that, dressed like the sun for this ballet. And in the previous image, we saw the face of the king as the sun. It is because the sun is the central star, everything spins around. So, as a symbol of it, the king was also the star in the court. And this star needed his galaxy, and that galaxy was the palace of Versailles, like here, a great city palace built in order to be the court of the king. The king here was the incarnation of all power. He was also a king dei gratia, meaning that he had the absolute power, not just because he was the king, but because he was on behalf of God. He was a religious figure. Going against the king wasn't just a crime, it was a sin. It was against religion. Here, since he was a child, we can see the king with all his attributes, the baton of command, the crown, the robes, the symbol of the globe showing universal power. Here, as adults, again, the crown, the baton of command, the sword, the mantle, etc. Here, with an armor, leading the armies. And of course, he needed ministers in order to exert his power, to control this kingdom. This kingdom were uh, bigger and bigger and more complex. So even when the king had the absolute power, he could not control himself. He needed the help of some advisors. Even the royal guards were luxuriously dressed These were the soldiers that protect directly the king, and these luxurious expenses were very important for the treasure of the country. We have talked when explaining the Spanish monarchy how a great amount of expenses were because of the luxury of the court. This happened as well in other countries. In that time, there were no differences between the money of the state and the money of the king. So when the king needed very luxurious words, for example, like here, or wanted to celebrate a feast or a ball or something like this, the whole country need to pay for that. Meaning that absolutism was very, very expensive for society. Here we can see the French soldiers. It's of course the time of the musketeers, the such as the ones in the book of the Three Musketeers. The soldiers, the French soldier with a musket, like here, this firearm. So absolutism. It's an absolute monarchy, meaning the king had the absolute power. It was hereditary, meaning that it passed from father to son, and of divine right, dei gratia, meaning that the king was considered to be named by God. So it wasn't just a human, he was some sort of prophet. His word was always right because he was led by God. They established centralism. This is very important. If you remember, the Spanish monarchy wasn't a centralized monarchy. They had different territories, different kingdoms, Castilla, Navarra, Aragon, Catalonia, Valencia, etc. And each one had its own laws, its own institutions, currency, and so on. The absolutism tried to fight this and create a centralized power with the head on the king, meaning that everything the king decides goes automatically for the whole territory. The legislative power, so making the laws, the executive power, so taking decisions, and the judicial power, judging the crimes, were all of them centralized on the monarch. He also controlled the foreign policy, so international relationship with other countries, and the army. He was the general of all the armies. But of course, the king could not rule on his own. He needed some help. This help was the one of the Council of State with ministers and secretaries and the royal delegates that went to the cities and to the different territories in order to impose the power of the king. The economies in that time were also controlled by the power. This is very important. It's the time of mercantilism. The mercantilism is the new economic system established in this time. We will explain it later. But the only limit to this absolute power was that he needed to respect the privilege. As you know, the privileged people were the ones that did not pay taxes, did not have to participate in the armies, uh, need some had some special rules that had to be respected, and they were, of course, the nobles and the members of the church. They need to be respected by the king. The king could not just erode these privileges freely, because if not, he would have lost their support. The institution that normally controlled the king was the general state, the courts, the parliament. The parliaments were institution that existed from the Middle Ages. They were called parliaments in England, cortes in Spain, État General in France, Diet in Germany. They existed and they were this institution that gather the representative of the country in order to control the power of the king. They remain existing, but what the king did was not convene them. So he did not call for this parliament to establish, so they could not control them because the parliament did not have some specific dates to meet, but they only meet when the king says so. So if the king did not call them, they will not act. The power of the king went everywhere, and there were symbols everywhere. This is a Louis d'Or, uh, a coin, a golden coin from France. Here we can see the king. Uh, LVD are the initials, so, well, the letters that represent the name Ludovicus, which is Louis in Latin. The 13th, DG, Dei Gratia. FR et NAV means Rex, so king of France and Navarre. Because since the Middle Ages, the kings of France consider themselves kings of Navarre as well. So we can see how the royal signs of power were everywhere. The economy in that time was, as we have said, controlled by the state in many aspects, and it was based on the market. For that reason, it's called mercantilism. The basis of mercantilism are quite simple. It was based on the importance of gold and silver because the coins were made up of them. So, if a country had lots of gold and silver, it was a rich country. How was the way to obtain these materials if the country did not have mines? Trade. They want to sell as much as they could and buy as less as possible. So they develop industry manufactures in order to have valuable products to sell, and they try to buy as little as they could. The government established some royal factories, such as this one in Seville, for artillery, for fire guns, cannons, that build important manufacturers. It could be manufacturers that were very valuable, for example, jewelry or mirrors or tapestry, something like this, or could be something important for the country, for example, for the army, like here. They were established and controlled by the king. They were the first factories in the world. And of course, trade was the most important thing. They established these trade companies, these commercial companies that had the monopoly over some areas of the market. For example, a trade company could control the silk or the valuable minerals or the routes to America. They have some monopoly and they could not have anyone competing with them because they were appointed by the king in order to control that branch of the market. So they were private companies, but with the privilege given by the king. They actually had their own symbols, their own some sort of coat of arms, like this one from Eastern India's Company on the currency. And we can see this same coin has been used in the east with this eastern seal. So they developed this triangular trade, as we have said, and we can see how more than just this area, there are other countries controlling it. So not just the Spanish in yellow and the Portuguese in orange, but also the French in green, all of this area, and the British, the English in blue. Northern Canada, the area of what are called the 13 colonies, origin of the nowadays United States, also Jamaica, and areas in India and Indonesia and Australia. And also the Dutch here that start colonizing all of these territories. They later lost them, but they start colonizing them. So mercantilism. It was based on the precious metals. Is if you were a country with lots of gold and silver, you were a rich country. So they want to obtain as much as they could. The way to obtain them was selling. They want to produce agricultural products and manufactures in order to be able to sell them and obtain gold and silver on exchange. They want to export as much as they could because that meant more precious metal coming to them. In order to grant this trade, there were commercial companies that had the monopoly of some branches of the market or some routes. They developed this domestic system that, as we have said, was when some merchant bought the raw materials, sell them to the people that work them on their houses. They sell them. They sell the finished products to this merchant, and the merchant take them to the city and sell them for a higher price, obtaining a profit. So it's some sort of factory without the building of the factory. And the royal manufacturers, the royal factories that were these first factories sponsored by the king. While France and slowly the rest of the European countries developed absolutism, other countries, especially England, became parliamentary systems. The parliamentarism is this system in which there is a parliament, so a group of people that control the power of the king. In England, they had the King Charles I that tried to be an absolute king. Being an absolute king, he tried to control everything on his estate, but the only thing he got was a revolution. A revolution and later a civil war started between the supporters of the king and the supporters of the parliament. The parliament supporters finally won and established a new system of government. This was also a religious war between the Catholic supporters of the king and the Protestant supporters of the parliament. Here we can see the reenactment of one of these battles, very common in England. And after the revolution succeeded, they took the son of the king, Charles II, and tried to control him. And for the father, Charles I, they beheaded him. They executed him, taking his head off, and established a new leader. This new leader was Oliver Cromwell, that became Lord Protector of England, creating a republic. That way, England was not a monarchy with a king, but a republic with this Lord Protector. But Cromwell did not have many supporters, and he finally was defeated. He was beheaded as well, and his head was put on a pike. There it was exposed for years until it passed to a private hands and it finally disappeared. We do not know where the head of Oliver Cromwell is. After the death of Oliver Cromwell, the son of the king, Charles II, here we can see him as an adult, was restored as a king. This is called the Restoration. The Restoration meant that the king went again in power, but he did not want to end as his father did, so he tried to control the royal power, giving more and more rights to the people and to the parliament. Especially, he passed some laws, or as they were called in England at that time, acts, especially the Habeas Corpus Act. This is very important. Habeas corpus is a legal term. Habeas corpus is a legal term meaning that when someone is taken prisoner or is arrested by the police officers need to report him to a judge and need to give the reasons of why that person was arrested. They cannot be arrested without a reason, and they cannot be arrested for a long time without any motive. They need to follow the regulation. This is the habeas corpus. This is a fragment of this habeas corpus act from 1679. Let's say that when some person is arrested, uh, they need to have this habeas corpus, this right directly into any sheriff or sheriff, the guards of the prison, by the people that take them there, and that officer or officers under officers. So the responsible of that prisoner need to take that prisoner to the judge or court in a place of in a period of time within 3 days. So when some person is arrested, the habeas corpus, so the document that grant that this person has been legally arrested for some specific reasons, need to be taken to the judge in 3 days, preventing the people to be for a long time in jail. And then, after the judge has seen this habeas corpus, he needs to decide if the arrest was legal or not, if there were legal reasons to maintain that person there, or that if he can be freed. If he can be freed, he can go. If that was a legal arrest, there is a period of time that cannot pass before the judgment of that person. It's a way to control the power of the monarch in order to, on the government in general, in order to grant that people cannot be arrested uh, indefinitely. But the successor of Charles II, James II, tried to rule as an absolute monarch again. Also, he was Catholic, and their religious problems started again. So, consequence was another revolution. They tried to defend their freedom and the rights of the parliament and the people. So there was a second civil war, and they again won. The king was expelled, and they named as king William of Orange, a, a leader of Dutch origin. He became William III that established this parliamentary system with more and more power to the parliament. And he established the Bill of Rights, a declaration of the human rights, one of the earliest documents that show the human rights, saying what can and cannot be done by the government and what rights need to be respected. The other greatest example of a parliamentary system were the United Provinces, so the Netherlands. As you know, these territories became independent from Spanish rule, and they did not were they weren't a monarchy but a parliamentary system. They have an statutor that was the leader of the parliament. The stat generals created under their the rule. Here we can see this parliament when it was controlled by the Spanish, because as you know, the United Provinces were before Spanish territory. And they have as a leader to William III again. As we have said, it was a Dutch leader that later was put as a king of England. So, the parliamentarism. In England, with Oliver Cromwell, there were a revolution and they established a republic. Then the restoration, they took the king again, established the habeas corpus in order to respect the rights of the prisoners. There were a second revolution that put William of Orange at the power, and the Bill of Rights, this Declaration of Rights for the citizens, was created. In the United Provinces, they were an independent republic, independent since they freed from the Spanish rule, with representatives of the local bourgeoisie. This country did not have an important nobility, did not have a king, so they were ruled by the British people in the cities, meaning that they will have a very important economic power, as they have political power as well. They have a federal chamber. Federal means that it's divided up in states. For example, nowadays the United States, and in that time, federal was, for example, the United Provinces, because each province had its own government, and they went all together in this chamber, this parliament. They have the Council of State that ruled the country and was whose leaders were elected voting, but not between everyone. It wasn't a real democracy. The leaders were always from the family Orange Nassau, but it wasn't an absolute monarchy because this Council of State, this federal chamber, had a great power to control the power, the king. The most famous case of parliamentarism in the world, as well as the most famous parliament ever, is the English one. This is nowadays the British Parliament. This is the oldest part of the parliament, the Westminster Hall from the 11th century, because remember that the parliament is not an invention from this time, but it's a medieval institution that is in this time where it gets its current situation. This is the inside of the House of Lords, inside this parliament, which looks like very similar than how it is nowadays, the House of Lords, because the British are very traditional. So the parliamentarism has some characteristics of what we nowadays consider essential for a democracy. They had separation of powers, so the executive, judicial, and legislative power, each one in a different branch of the government. So executive make taking decisions, legislative creating the laws, and judicial, which is judging the crimes. The executive power was in the king and the parliament, the legislative power was in the parliament, and the judicial power was in the courts. The parliament as well choose the prime minister, which nowadays is was the main political post in the land. They had limited suffrage, Suffrage is the right to vote. It wasn't universal suffrage, so not everybody could vote, but just some people, the richest of them. And also, not everybody could elect it as a member of the parliament. There was a House of Lords that was reserved for the nobles and the members of the church, so nobles and especially bishops. And there was the House of Commons, that was the representatives of the common people, especially from the major cities. This part was elected voting. They could vote laws and taxes and control the power of the king. This is the parliamentarism system. We can see how different it is from the absolutism one. The separation of powers. It's a very important concept, still relevant nowadays, that consists on the division between executive, legislative, and judicial power, typical of the parliamentary system and nowadays from democracies. The executive power is in the government, the legislative power is in the parliaments, and the judicial power is in hands of the judge and the courts, the judicial courts. One of the most important happenings that took place in the 17th century was the 30 Years' War. This was a huge conflict that affected most countries in Europe, especially in Central Europe, and had different reasons. It had a religious cause. Here we can see in orange the territories of the Habsburg that were Catholic, and in green the Protestant territories, or their allies. So it started in the empire, where, as we have seen, there were differences between the Protestant and the Catholic, and as the war started here, the Spanish king, that was from the same family, the Habsburg, than the emperor, helped the the emperor to fight the Protestant. Then the Swedish and the Danish uh, united the war and entered the war, and then the French. The French were an strange circumstance because they were not Protestant, but they helped the Protestant. Why? Because their greatest enemies were the Spanish and the Imperials. So he wanted to defeat them, and for that reason he joined their enemies. It was a political measure that in previous times would have been impossible because a Catholic country was fighting against other Catholics in order to defend the Protestant. But we are reaching a time where religion, while it's very important for a country, the survival of their own country is more and more important. This is one of the consequences of the 30 Years' War. That changed in many aspects how we understand the power and what are the roles of the countries. It was a war of classes between the bourgeoisie and nobility. On the right hand, we have the Spanish and the imperials, traditional countries with a great importance of nobility. On the other hand, we can see, like in this image, more modern, uh, economically important countries such as the Dutch that has relevance of the bourgeoisie. It was a conflict between them. Here we can see, for example, in Belgium, the houses of the guilds, uh, one of the most important institutions for the bourgeois. But it has different causes. We have talked about the religious one, we have talked about the social one, but there was also a national cause. It's the rise of the nation states, so the individual countries that want to be independent and considered equal than any other country. So it was the Habsburg against the new powers, especially the French, and the empire and the papacy, so the Pope, against the nation states. This is very important. So the greatest medieval power, the empire and the Pope, against the new modern powers, which are the countries. This kind of mentality was the one that could lead to, for example, the French to ally against the Catholic, because while they were Catholic as well, they considered the well-being of France more important than the Pope, for example. So Protestantism against Counter-Reformation, so Catholicism, defended by Spanish and the Empire, and social conflict, nobles, especially Spanish and from the Empire, against the new bourgeoisie from the Protestant countries. It all started in the Empire when the Emperor Ferdinand II was appointed as King of Bohemia. It is because of the royal relationship between the families. He was a Catholic, one of the greatest defenders of Catholicism, and Bohemia was a Protestant country. So when he wanted to be named as a king, there were revolts. And they increased, and the commissioners of the emperor were defenestrated. Defenestration means being thrown uh, outside the window. That's a that's the war. And after that, after they were defenestrated, these same emissaries received from the emperor the title of fallen from above, which could sound as a joke, but it was what he gave them. They actually fall in a pile of dump, so they did not suffer injuries, but they were humiliated. It was a terrible war that isolated Europe. Here we can see, for example, the Black Riders, typical of the German army, and some French cavalrymen. The infantry was again very important. The firearms developed, the tactics, and the way of fighting changes. Here are some the weapons they used, some of the battles that meant the more and more countries were joining this war. We have said, for example, after the empire went to war, the Spanish joined. Then other countries. There were different actions against the armies or the population. For example, this in Prague. Remember the execution of 27 people during this 30 years war. The King of Denmark joined the war. The Dutch joined the war. They were both Protestant. The King of Sweden as well, expanding the war more and more and more throughout the different lands. Actually, the King of Sweden died on battle. And the French joined as well. We have said it was this tactic of uh, political calculation, saying that they will support Protestant for reinforce France against their enemy. It was a war that took place everywhere, land and water, and with thousands and thousands of people. Their consequences, of course, were terrible, and they meant a change of power in Europe. For example, the Spanish lost their hegemony, definitely their armies, the tercios, were defeated, for example, in Rocroi, that we have already mentioned, meaning that they lose the hegemony over the European lands. It was also terrible for loots and pillaging of villages, the destruction, fires on villages and houses, trying to destroy the crops, to defeat the enemy, to kill the traitors or helpers of other countries, etc. The execution due to nationalism or religious reason, and uh, in general, devastation of the land. We have said how this 30 Years' War developed. First, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire was rejected in Bohemia. The Spanish intervened, then the Danish, the English, the Dutch, the Swedish, and the French. Basically, was the Habsburg, so the emperor and Spain against all the others. What happened? The Habsburg were defeated, so their power started to shamble. They could not act as the main power anymore. There were mercenary, more and more people recruited for the armies and pillaging, meaning that the economic loss was great, increasing the crisis of the 17th century that we have said. Economy of war was established, meaning that all of the resources of a country were devoted to uh, to winning the war. This could not be supported by the weak economy of the Spain, for example, and the later destruction of lands, infrastructures, death of people, and so on was terrible for this economic development. There were famine, repression, uh, diseases, and bandits roaming the land, meaning that it was a terrible time for everyone. But of course, this war had its consequences, and their consequences were the change of power in Europe. The Peace of Westphalia was signed, meaning the end of the 30 Years' War, and it has very important consequences, especially for the empire that lost territories. For example, this part was lost to Holland, this part to Brandenburg, Saxony, to the Palatine, to France. Switzerland became independent, as well as the Netherlands, definitely as a part of the war they had with Spain. The Spanish lost territories. For example, we talk about the Roussillon and Sardinia to France, and territories in Flanders. And especially they lost the hegemony they had. Who was the greatest beneficiary of these consequences? The French, that became the major power in Europe. So the Peace of Westphalia meant the religious tolerance. This is very important. The uh, the way religion was viewed open changed. The religion was no longer the main reason to leave the country. The different religion, Christian religion, so Protestantism and Catholicism, were allowed in, for example, the empire. We said that with the Peace of Augsburg in the 16th century, this was already accepted, but it needs to be repeated. More important, a political balance was reached between nation states absolutists, so that practice absolutism, like we have explained for France, and they were nation states, meaning that each one was an independent country that wasn't subdued to anyone. Remember that in the Middle Ages there were two main powers, the emperor and the pope, that had the right to influence other nations' politics. With the nation states, this was no longer possible. As well, a nation state corresponds to a nation, so a group of people that share a culture, a language, some characteristic, etc. For example, the empire, either the Holy Roman Empire or the Spanish Empire, rule over very different people. We have said, for example, that the Holy Roman Empire had lots of different territories inside, each one with its own characteristics. And some of them became independent, for example, Netherlands or Switzerland. It's the origin of smaller states than the previous larger empire that could rule on their own, by their own people. So Netherlands was ruled by the Dutch. Uh, Switzerland was ruled by the Swiss. They did not have to obey to a superior power, a foreign power. Netherlands and Switzerland became independent. French became the most important country in Europe, but it wasn't an empire. This is very important. It was a nation state. So it was France, ruled by the French, and it did not have direct power over other territories. In general, they were some specific lands that had different characteristics, but in general, it was France. It was a country in the sense that we understand it. Nowadays, there are not great empires that subdue many different people. We live in a world of nation states, and this started in this moment. It's the fragmentation of the empire that was divided into nation states and lost a great amount of its power, and the decline of the Habsburg, both the emperor and the Spanish king. They were no longer the rulers of Europe, and they need to let this sovereignty to the French. So, to clarify a little bit more what a nation state is, it's a politically independent territory, so a country, whose population shares some historical and cultural characteristic, and they became general after the Peace of Westphalia. So instead of having a great empire ruling over lots of different territories, such as the Roman Empire or the Holy Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire or the Caliphate or any of the medieval empire we have seen, each one of these different territories is slowly becoming an independent country, leading to a world like the one we know nowadays, where there are no empire but individual countries. This meant that the empires reduced their power, and rulers such as the Pope or the Emperor that had influence over the different countries do not have it anymore. For example, nowadays, one of the main characteristics of a country is that they are independent, meaning that no one can force a country to do anything they do not want to, because each country has its own ruler and no one is over them. They are more or less independent, or sorry, more or less important countries, but each one is independent. Each one is a nation state. It is also one of the bases of nationalism. So the right and the will to defend their own nation against the enemies. For example, the pride to be French and defend France, or to be German and defend Germany, etc. This was not possible in an empire because, for example, in the Spanish Empire, you could be Spanish But you could not say all of my empire is Spanish because there were Belgium, Italy, part of the French Comté, so different territories with different characteristics. But slowly we are getting to this structure of nation states. So that was the end of our unit. As in previous ones, I do not expect you to do lots of exercise because I know you have plenty to do. We are only doing this test of Unit 14. It's an online test. I know it's very easy to do them almost perfect, but please uh, pay attention to the answers. Watch carefully this video because it can help you to do this second project we are having to do as the evaluation project of the second part of the term. It will be about the unit 13 and 14. I will upload it to the Aula Virtual as soon as possible, and it won't take you so much, but I expect you to think about it. I don't want you to memorize loads of things or to start telling me thousands of data, but I want you to reflect on what we have learned and the importance it can have for our world. So that was everything. It was the end of our unit and the end of our year. It's the last time we are studying now, so I can only say thank you for going with me through all of this strange and chaotic year. I hope you have learned something, even if it's not exactly what we have planned to learn or in the way we are used to. And I hope you all have some learning from this extraordinary experience we are living together. Thank you very much.